The average 71-year-old African-American Californian has lost $1.2 million over the course of their lifetime. After 2 years of study, the California Reparations Task Force released an almost 1,100-page report that examines the historical atrocities committed against descendants of enslaved African-Americans in California and across the United States.
We hired 5 economists and public policy experts to help us determine the pure monetary losses of the African-American community since statehood.
To calculate those losses, the team assessed multiple harm areas, including mass incarceration and overpolicing, health harms, housing discrimination, and the devaluation of Black businesses.
Our recommendations are not just about cash payments. That's just one of many recommendations that really are aimed at improving the quality of life of descendants of slaves in the state of California.
The task force made nearly 120 policy recommendations, ranging from cash payments to improving educational opportunities to increasing access to green spaces in African American communities.
Under international human rights law, there are 5 forms of reparation. So compensation or cash payments is just one, necessary element. But there's also 4 other elements like rehabilitation. So that can look like free healthcare, establishing wellness centers in African-American communities, restitution, satisfaction. So that looks like a formal apology, for instance, for California's role in slavery and exclusionary public policy after slavery. And then the 5th form of reparations is guarantees of non-repetition. So that gets at more structural and policy reform.
If you thought California didn't have enslavement, you're not alone. Moore says it's a common misconception. And while California was admitted to the Union in 1850 as a so-called free state,
there were over 2,000 Black people who were enslaved in California. And California also enacted a fugitive slave law that was actually much more aggressive than the federal fugitive slave law that was on the books at the time.
So how do Californians know if they could qualify for the reparations recommended in the report?
It's not a race-based standard, but it's a status or lineage-based standard.
That means those considered eligible are people directly descended from an enslaved African American or a free Black person living in the U.S. prior to 1900.
Reparations is a sacred political project. It started with those who were actually enslaved. Even during slavery and even after emancipation, there's been a long line of activists who have been working tirelessly for reparations for African Americans, particularly those who are descendants of enslaved people.
The centuries-long fight for reparations has been fought in the face of what the task force describes as an ongoing genocide.
When we're talking about the elements of genocide, we're talking about the killing of members of a group, preventing the births of members of the group, deliberately inflicting serious bodily harm against members of the group, or mental harm. So we look at, for instance, the average African-American Californian who's descended of slaves have a 7-year life expectancy gap between them and white Californians. That's due to unequal funding of medical facilities, epigenetic trauma due to enslavement. We talk about the Black maternal health rates, Black infant mortality rates, Black women and girls, lead in those areas as well. So we make several different arguments in terms of how historically and presently those who descend from slaves are ongoing victims of a genocide, albeit slow and protracted.
So the question remains, will lawmakers take action to follow the policy recommendations in the report?
I am incredibly hopeful that state legislators will do the right thing and study our report with an open heart and mind, and by the end of 2024, early 2025, you'll probably see some reparations legislation being introduced by these state legislators.